Thank you for coming out on a Sunday afternoon. And before we turn our attention to our conversation, we are gathering at a time when Israel is at war. And so I'd like to begin, I know, it's true. I'd like to begin with a prayer for the welfare of the state of Israel. Please rise. Avinu Shabashamayim, Sur Yisrael v'goalo, Barech et Medinat Yisrael, Reshit Smichat Gulatenu, Hagen Aleha be'evrat chastecha, Ufros Aleha sukat shlomecha, Ushlach orcha v'amitcha l'rasheha, Sareha v'yoatzeha, V'takneim be'etzat tova milfanecha, Chazek yidei migen eretz kadshenu, V'anchilem Eloheinu Yeshua, V'ateret nitzachon tatrem, V'natata shalom ba'aretz, V'simchat olam liyoshveha, V'nomar Amen. Friends, you may be seated. It's our pleasure to welcome Rabbi Cosgrove back to the Anshe Emet Synagogue. Though I don't think I need to review his bio with you, the next time I see Elliot's mother, I want to be able to look her in the eye. So. Elliot was ordained at the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1999. He served as a rabbi at the Anshe Emet Synagogue until 2008. He received his PhD from the U of C Divinity School. And since that time, Elliot has served as the senior rabbi of the Park Avenue Synagogue in New York City. He now serves as an adjunct faculty member at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He's an officer of the New York Board of Rabbis. He serves on the boards of the New York Federation, the American Joint Distribution Committee, the Hillel at the University of Michigan. He represented the AJC at the 9/11 Memorial and during the visit of Pope Francis to New York. He's the author of Jewish Theology for Our Time, and now for such a time as this. And Elliot, on behalf of all of us, I want to say that we had such high hopes for you. How did you become such an underachiever? Anyway. Let's begin. Let's begin with the title, For Such a Time as This. And before we talk about the title itself, which I'm sure you'll enlighten us about, I think it's important just to note that all of us have felt the whiplash since October 7th. And like all of us, this is not theory. We are living in real time. All of us know people or are related to people in Israel who have suffered. Ellie, you have a nephew serving in the IDF. So let's begin by talking about the personal side of all of this from your perspective.
Thank you, Rabbi Siegel. Thank you, my friend, my mentor, my colleague, my first job, Rabbi Siegel. Just being in this room. I mean, the last time I was here, it was for your bar mitzvah, right, when you had your 40th, was it 40th? Mm-hmm. So Mazel Tov. And it's just overwhelming to be here in the sanctuary that gave me my start. The thing that I want to say about the book to begin is in the acknowledgments, I make a point which means a lot to me. It may be misunderstood by other people, that whereas the job of a rabbi is often understood to be about giving people faith, the way a rabbinic career happens is people putting their faith in their clergy. And this community, the Anshe Emet community, is the group of people, and I look around this room and I see faces, and we've been together for simchas and sorrows, and I see people here, and I see memories of people who are not here, and I am just so very grateful to the Anshe Emet family at a far earlier moment of my career where the edges were very rough, and you forgave me many, many times for putting your faith in me. And at the top of that list is you, Rabbi Siegel, who mentored me, who gave me a platform, who helped me literally in this room find my voice. I will forever be grateful to you for all of your mentorship.
Thank you. I just want to say, let me just say very briefly that I know, even though I began kind of in a kidding way, all of us shep a great deal of nachas and pride watching the trajectory of your career, and also listening to your voice as you speak from one of the most important pulpits in the United States. So Elliot, thank you for everything you do.
So I'll try to address the question about the title and the personal dimensions all in one. Am I calling you Michael or Rabbi?
Michael works just
okay.
fine.
All right, you can call me. It's your sanctuary. I don't know. So for such a time as this, from the chapter 4 of the book of Esther, in Hebrew, Et Kazot, that Esther literally hid herself, her Jewish identity, believing that that was a ticket towards rising to the heights of ancient Persian society. The story that we read on Purim becomes the sort of biblical spine of this book. And when I was seeking to try to make sense of what we were going through as American Jews in a historic arc, that was a readily applicable narrative, in the sense that there was a promise of America, of American Jewry. We believed ourselves on a trajectory towards feeling comfortable. And I begin the book talking about hyphenated identities, that we can be Jews and Americans all at the same time. You know, the Brandeis vision that we can be better Americans by supporting Israel, that our Zionism and our patriotism were not in conflict one with the other. And this was really the promise of the Enlightenment and the promise of American Jewry. And we bought into it. And many of us actually found a way to negotiate that hyphenated identity, and believed that that was like Esther, though Esther hid her identity, that was a promise of the land. And then the wicked decree of Haman came down, and we know how the story goes. And it was at that moment, by way of an emissary, that Esther's uncle Mordecai says, Esther, don't think that you'll escape this moment when the Jewish people are on the line. And who knows if it was not for such a time as this that you've arrived at your station. And we know, because we dress our kids subsequently in costumes for Esther, that she won the day. She rose to the moment, both as a woman, as a Jew, and as a queen. And that was the victory of Esther in that very dark moment of ancient history. And that this moment for us is also our Esther moment. That we believed a certain narrative, we believed that we could be proud Zionists, proud Americans, that we could be safe as Jews, that somehow our story was an exception to Jewish history, to the narrative of European Jewry, of other Jewish communities, and we believed a certain exceptionalism of American Jewish identity. And on October 7th and subsequent to it, we'll probably get into this, we realized that maybe it ain't so. Maybe we are just another chapter in a much, much longer story of Jewish history. And I think that for some, I think you used the word whiplash of that moment, I think one of the subplots of the last year of our lives is for some, maybe a younger generation, and I talk about this in the book, the personal narratives that happened in my office of people saying, where did all this come from? How is this possible? And then for others, there was a sort of wagging of the finger, I told you so, right? That this was always there beneath the surface. It just took October 7th for it to come out. And so the various communities have responded to, of American Jews, responded to October 7th differently based on your generational moment.
And yet, you and I have invested a great deal of time into the causes of others in this country. You've marched, I've marched. You have reached out in the interfaith universe. You spoke before the Pope. And there is this sense that no one is talking to us anymore. That so many of the people that we would have thought would pick up the phone and call, stand with us after the horror of October 7th, were nowhere to be found. How do you understand that? How do you deal with that?
I think the silence of the progressive communities that we have invested a huge amount, you, Michael, more than anyone, with interfaith and Jewish black relationships here in Chicago, it was crickets and a sense of existential loneliness that was felt, that the crimes that were perpetrated, they weren't just crimes against Israelis and not just against Jews, but they were crimes against humanity, that any person of conscience should have found them to be abhorrent and contrary to any notion of civilized behavior. This wasn't a debate over, one border versus another border. These were acts of physical, sexual, inhuman acts perpetrated by one group against another that deserving of condemnation from all. And I think the American Jewish community, at least from my vantage point in New York, felt a sense of isolation and a sense of betrayal. That why is it that Asian lives, gay lives, black lives, all lives matter, but when it comes to Jewish lives, somehow they matter less? And I don't know what the politic of the Chicago Jewish community has been, but there's been a lot of soul searching in the alphabet soup of the ADL, AJC, et cetera, JCRCs. Why are we investing so much time, effort in bridge building when push comes to shove, we find ourselves standing alone? Is this not a shields up moment as opposed to a bridge building moment, which we can talk about that, whether it is a binary of either or but I think that this sort of sense of loneliness, betrayal, and has really been part of this year. But can we make this a dialogue?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you've the last decade to multiple decades of your career, you've invested a huge amount of time in black-Jewish relations. Have those What's the arc been in this past year? Have you felt that same sense of betrayal?
For sure. With one exception, Pastor Chris Harris has stood the ground. He has stood with us, and in fact, I invited him to be with us in the community hall on Yom Kippur precisely for that reason, because the Jewish community has, and I think rightly, felt hurt and angry about this, but we should not forget to thank those who have stood up with us and not brush with too broad a brush. Tomorrow I'm meeting with a very well-known black pastor who has said some really, really ugly things. I was witness to them. I was in the room with him. And I thought about it, and I wanted to walk away, but I chose to call him, invited him to come and have a conversation. So tomorrow he's coming by, and we're going to have a long talk. I am not willing to give up the room. I'm not willing to walk away. I think that so much of what we are faced with is this understanding by those who are protesting loudly that we're supposed to be ashamed. And we are really supposed to walk away with our tail between our legs, as if we are genocidal, as if we do believe in colonialism, etc. I'm just unwilling to cede the room to them. I'm unwilling to not have the conversation in the hope, and here I'm borrowing something that Dara Horn said not all that long ago when we had a conversation with her on Yom Kippur afternoon, that maybe not everyone is Haman, but there are more Achashverosh's out there who just don't have enough facts. Now, the new Ta-Nehisi Coates book is not going to be helpful to us in this conversation. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to call out and to try. That doesn't mean we try forever, but that's my answer. I'm interested to know how you respond to that. Do you think that's a fool's errand? Do you think that that's just...
No, I agree, I guess. I think that the either or, the binary is, we have to be better than that. I think that, look, you also don't, I'll use the I language, I don't invest in interfaith, interrace, that bridge building simply because I want those relationships when the chips are down. You invest in those relationships because those relationships are important to invest in, period, as a reflection of what Jews should do. And so I do believe that whether it's one-on-one with a colleague of yours, a friend of yours, a neighbor of yours, or if it is happening on a cross-communal level, I do think that we need to invest in those relationships. I think we need to show ourselves to be human, articulate our answers. I mean, one of the big problems of this moment is the refusal to normalize a conversation by the other, right? If I am willing to have a conversation, there are multiple sides, I can have a textured understanding, there are good people and bad people in Israel, not every country is perfect, but if that other is not even willing to sit down with me, because as a Jew, as a Zionist, as someone who believes in the right to self-determination of the Jewish people in their historic homeland, then I'm somehow treif. Then what do you do at that point? I don't have a great answer to that question, because there are people who will not sit down to talk with the Jewish community right now. You
are a proud Zionist. You speak about it, you let people know that almost immediately. Your relationship, your credentials in that area are unshakable. I'd like to think that I've done I've made my own effort in that area.
You're known to be a Zionist.
Yes, I am. Okay.
I saw a tweet.
So I guess here's the line for me. If someone is unwilling to sit down with me because I'm a Zionist, then that's a bridge too far for me. Because what they're really telling me is that you are only acceptable in the way that I'm going to write your story for you. And that's the line that I would draw. I don't know about you, but that's how I would think about it.
You're talking inside anti-Zionists outside of the Jewish community?
Outside of the Jewish community. We'll talk about anti-Zionists within the Jewish community, but outside the Jewish community, if someone says, I really like you, I'm just sorry you're a Zionist, I would unpack that. But to me, that becomes the line. Because what that tells me is not only am I treif and not only am I unacceptable, but the state of Israel is unacceptable, that the Jewish homeland's unacceptable. So that's how I guess that's how I would approach it.
Right. And I guess it's good. It's funny talking to you. We talk privately all the time, and so to have a conversation like this publicly is a little disorienting. I'm trying to figure out, Michael, whether I would ever, under what conditions would I fully write another human being off, right? If I were to be sitting at a Starbucks and someone were to say, and they have a label on them that says, I'm an anti-Zionist, and, da-da-da-da, would I ask a probing question? Would I engage in dialogue with that person? Or would I simply, I think there's institutional levels by which this happens, and then there's interpersonal. I do believe that relationships, I'm a huge believer in the power of hand-to-hand, one-on-one. Mm-hmm. One-on-one.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in cups of coffee.
Absolutely, and I wouldn't not sit down with someone. I just wouldn't sit down with them again.
Right.
And I because there's a line there when I'm unacceptable the way that I am. I would never say that to a Christian. Wouldn't. I would respect that. I do understand that as Jews, we're more complicated. We're not a religion, and we're not an ethnicity, we're not a people, we're not a nation, we're all of them, we're an Am. I get that. But that's the conversation. That's the conversation. But there has to be a red line. Do you have a red line in these conversations?
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so, but I think that if someone, look, I think that there's a difference between Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and otherwise, but what they all have in common is the stated desire for the destruction of the state of Israel. I think that there are moments in time, both from a military standpoint and as American Zionists from an advocacy standpoint, where what's Golda Meir's famous quote, you can't negotiate with someone who's seeking to destroy you. So there is a moment in time where we have nothing to say. And I think that's fair. I think that's fair. I think that if someone is set on the violent destruction of the Jewish people or the Jewish state, then they've put their cards on the table. Yeah.
All right, well, let me skip ahead then, because, and we'll come back, but because we don't need to go outside of the Jewish community to see red lights flashing. We have lots of young adults who are walking away from Israel, and I know many parents sitting in this room who are having trouble having conversations with their own children about Israel. A lot of head shaking, yes.
Well, these are the ones I bar mitzvahed.
Yeah. So thank you, because I actually have sent that to the congregation. It was his fault. It's his fault. So in your book, you have a compelling conversation, and I should say a more compelling post-conversation, with a friend of your daughter Lucy, who many of us remember, who you give the pseudonym Maya. So let's talk about that. Tell the story, please.
So this story has the benefit of being true, unlike all the other rabbinic stories that rabbis tell about their family.
You weren't supposed to say that.
So this is a young woman who, I joke, shares a brain with my own daughter, grown up as a bat bait, a product of my household, and confronted me over dinner. We were breaking, I think, Passover over pizza together, and said, Rabbi Cosgrove, which is the signal that she's about to ask me a tough question. And she says, I notice, actually, you don't,
we have it, no, it's
you
over
have
here.
it here, you've moved the bima. But she said, I've noticed you have an Israeli flag on the bima. I notice you at Park Avenue Synagogue that you also say the prayer for the state of Israel, a nationalist expression of Jewish identity. And this was all a setup for her to self-identify as a non-Zionist, as someone who felt that she could not countenance support for a state of Israel that didn't represent her liberal Jewish values. And a small fortune had been invested in her Jewish education through camping, Jewish day school, gap year program. I mean, this was the best and the brightest. And here I was trying to make a defense, and I didn't respond in the moment, but the chapter in the book is what I would have said to Maya, because every one of my children's friends is made up of 2 vowels and 2 consonants, Neely, Tali, Nomi, right? And so I just picked Maya. And what I said to her in this conversation was, the most interesting thing about the Maya chapter is the intended audience of it is not Maya. The intended audience of it is someone of our generation looking around the room who's figuring out how to speak to Maya's generation, given the choice of whether they are sent away from the table, the Jewish table, or whether we engage in conversation with the Mayas of the world. And I come down in that chapter by way of example, saying we have to engage in a conversation. We cannot write the primary scaffolding of Jewish education is a Passover Seder, Ki yishalcha bincha machar, when your child asks you a tough question, this is what you shall say. Now, yes, we do have the wicked child who gets rapped on the teeth. Not every idea spoken by a younger generation needs to be coddled and affirmed, but I think we have to ask the probing questions of that generation, and also have our own sense of humility, or maybe not humility, but right, you can't blame a person for the time that they were born into, right? So to take the Maya that I actually, right, her only point of reference is Netanyahu as prime minister. She has no memory of otherwise. Her only point of reference is Israel with a policy of settlements in the West Bank. And her only point of reference is Israel being the Goliath to the Palestinian David, right? That's her reality. And so the question is, well, how are you going to engage in conversation with that generation? And so I try to model how that conversation goes in the chapter. And so ultimately I say that her voice is an important voice at the Jewish table, and that given the choice of exiting the Jewish community or trying to effectuate change towards creating an Israel that reflects both her Jewish ideals and her liberal ideas, I would hope that she would choose to become a stakeholder in the conversation.
What are some of the don'ts? These are the do's. What are the don'ts for parents?
I mean, this is going to sound really silly, but like, don't say who thinks such a thing. Don't say where the, did you get such an idea? Don't say, like this is now my young kids are a little older, but I find that when I sort of zap an idea at my dinner table, whether it's about Israel or about anything, then I inevitably get the opposite response that I was intending. So, and I've learned this the hard way. So I think that the don'ts are to undercut the right of someone to have a stated opinion. I think the do's are to ask a probing question, right? So let's use an example. If someone says, well, Judaism's not a nationalist identity, I'm post-nationalist, I don't believe that we should be having nation states, and I don't think Jews should have a nation state, certainly not one that no longer reflects the Maya's Jewish values, right? So then the question is, okay, so now let's take that stated view and hold it against the lens of 6 million. And let's hold it against the lens of millennial, years of Jewish, persecution, dispersion, and vulnerability. And explain to me, right, I think it was also Golda Meir who said something that if Jews put down their arms, the next day there would be peace. But no, if the Arabs put down their arms, the next day there would be peace. If the Jews put down their arms, the next day there'd be no Israel, right? So whereas Maya, I appreciate your view that, right, Israel doesn't represent your values, explain to me exactly what your vision of 7 million of your Jewish brothers and sisters, what comes of their fate in your imagined world of no state of Israel. And then do the most important thing of all, shut up. Force that young person to actually respond to you, asking a non-confrontational but question that comes from a place of curiosity. And you might not win that win's the wrong word. That person might not cede your point, but when that person leaves to have a conversation back on campus or otherwise, they will have that voice in their heads.
I think what you're saying is very important, because at the end of the day, all we can do is plant seeds. And you never know when those seeds are going to come to fruition. And God willing, our children will have long lives. And they, as we all know, our views change. Our views evolve. I'm not sure I could really relate to my 20-year-old self today. I'm not sure you could either. And so we need to kind of cut our kids some slack. And I think what you're saying is such an important statement. But is there any commitment that we could expect from reasonably ask of them? Some way where our young people also feel that, Kol Yisrael Arivim Zeh B'Zeh, that, all Israel is responsible for one another. Where is there anywhere in there that and I struggle with this, so I'm just asking you to think about that for a minute. Can we ask our kids to take responsibility simply because they are Jews for the Jewish people on some level?
So what would be an example, meaning?
I don't want anything to do with Jews. I don't identify, if this is what Judaism is, I don't want any part of it, right? If this is what Israel is, I don't want any part of it, even though more than half of our people live there. Right. So can we talk about that idea of responsibility somewhere? And is that an idea that should be planted as well?
Yeah, Hebrew arevut, the idea of one Jewish person being responsible for another, whether or not that person lives in a second floor walk-up in the former Soviet Union or in Afula, right? I think that I'm not going to say we all know, I believe that Jewish identity is a sense of global responsibility. That is a value that we pass down from one generation to another. I think that one of the sins of the last, right, Yom Kippur is still in the rear view mirror, of Cheshbon HaNefesh, of auditing of the soul, that the organized Jewish community, known as the OJC, needs to conduct, is that we made support for the state of Israel the religion, if not the orthodoxy, of our people. And in doing so, right, Arthur Hertzberg of blessed memory had a line that the only thing that you could be excommunicated by the Jewish people, American Jewry, was non-support of the state of Israel. And I think that sin has, what's the expression, has come to roost, yeah. Right? And so a young person today who says, if the only way the organized Jewish community can have me, believes that Judaism can be expressed is by way of support for this or that Israeli government, then that's an organized Jewish community that I don't want to be part of. And I think, and I will own this because I think as the rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue, I'm part of the OJC, I think we're paying the price for that. And so part of my prescriptive recommendations for moving forward is, staunch as we are with Zionism, we need to have a more textured approach as to what support for Israel actually means, mm-hmm. and not zap people for, falling this way or that way, but we can have a breadth of conversation as, maybe not exactly as, but we'll probably get into this, but wide, reflecting the wide views of Israelis themselves. And I also think we have to be really, really careful of essentializing our Jewish identity down to this or that Israeli government. Being Jewish is far better than that.
Before we leave this idea, because I want to explore this with you, before we leave our children, I do think it's worthy of note that the discussions that go on amongst young people in America are very different than the discussions that young Jews are having in Europe. We're not seeing the anti-Zionism in Europe amongst European Jews, especially younger Jews, that we see here. And so we have to factor.
What do you think? Do you think that's because we're privileged in a way that?
No, I do think we're privileged. I think that's kind of the, it's also part of the American exceptionalism that we have this rarefied view of the world, which of course has been, shattered to a certain extent this past year. But I do think that that's where part of that comes from. So I just want to posit that, and I want to because I think it's worthy of note, and I think at the very least it's something for all of us to think about. Why is that, and why, and what can we learn from that, or what should we learn from that? Since we live in a world where the kinds of things that are happening in America, we used to think only happen across the ocean, only happen somewhere else. And so there's been a huge wake-up call in the American Jewish community. And I think people are feeling it. I think people are feeling off balance, as I think we should. But kind of coming back to this issue of criticizing, every person in this room knows that what Elliot said a moment ago to be true. Everybody's had a conversation with somebody where they have criticized something going on in Israel and gotten a very stern lecture. You're not allowed to say that. If when your kids serve in the army, that's when you can criticize Israel. And one of the things that I think is so important in your book, and so important about your rabbinate, Elliot, is that you haven't shied away from criticizing Israel, being critical, but being critical of Israel, but at the same time really modeling what it means to love Israel. And you make that point beautifully in the book, but I want you to talk a little bit about that idea, because if Jews can't criticize Israel from a place of love, then we've really lost something.
Right. Well, first of all, let me say I struggle with it. I think we all struggle with it. Yeah. And I think the book, I talk about a few principles of how to criticize Israel from a place of love. But I'm allowed to promote. I'm on a book thing.
Why stop now?
So, like, I just wrote a piece in The Hill in the last 24 hours about the release of the hostages. I wrote a piece in Haaretz similarly of how one can assert one's Zionist credentials and in the same breath speak openly about those decisions of Israel that we agree with and those decisions that we don't agree with. And I think one of the failings of those on the, let's say, the far progressive left is that their criticisms of Israel are not contextualized in a place of love. And that's where I would draw a line between me. And so any time I open my mouth about Israel, my career hopefully speaks for it, but I will always assert Israel's right to self-defense, self-determination, and otherwise. And I will say that because I believe that Israel, the dream of Israel, as stated in its founding documents, is to be both a Jewish and democratic state, I believe that not just out of love of the Palestinians' hope for self-determination, but because I have a certain vision of what Israel stands for, Israel must prosecute this war as if there's no tomorrow, and Israel must prosecute this war with an eye to creating a tomorrow of a two-state solution. And I am very worried when I see moves by the present Israeli government that seem to be running counter to that hoped-for vision. But it comes in a certain package where, no different than my criticism of this or that American government is an expression of my patriotism and love of country, any reflections, recommendations, prescriptions I might have for Israeli policy comes from a place of profound existential investment in the well-being of the state and the people of Israel.
So I'm going to quote from the piece in The Hill that you referenced. This is truly a gut-check moment for every person of conscience to press for the release of the hostages whose freedom offers the fastest path to a desperately needed ceasefire and to a day-after plan in Gaza. Now is the time, and by the way, you reference this with the death of Yahya Sinwar. Now is the time for the entire global community to stand united in its demand for their immediate release. Whatever one's views may be on the Israel-Hamas conflict, the continued captivity of the hostages is an outrageous human rights violation that must come to an end. It's very compelling, and I hear the criticism of Israel, and it comes from a place of love. But are you asking for the ceasefire now? Is that what you're talking about when you say this? I mean, because that's what's going to come back, right? If in order to release the hostages, assuming that whoever's running Hamas would actually release the hostages, but that there will be the release of God knows how many Palestinian terrorists, and some sort of end of this conflict. Is that, I just want to know if that's what you're saying when you write.
All right, so there's two issues in that paragraph that you just read. One of substance and one of style. So the one of substance is how to get these hostages back. Mm-hmm. And I think, and you might disagree with me, you might agree with me, I don't know, but I came out of Yom Kippur just in a cocoon-like depression that these human lives are unaccounted for, hanging in the balance in the most inhuman condition. I just want them out. I just want them out. That's how I feel. I don't expect you to feel the same way. It's how I feel. And I feel that, and I do, and this is my criticism of everything I just said about the desire of Israel's enemies to wipe Israel off the map stands. And I think what's that expression? If everything you see is a nail, then the only tool you have is a hammer, right? My fear is that that is a condition that the present Israeli government suffers from, that they are not working as actively, diplomatically as they could be, as they are militarily. And so in the article, I make the point substantively, which again, I don't know how you feel about this, Michael. Take the win, you have a moment, let's bring these hostages home and fight another day or figure out the next way. I actually don't use the language of ceasefire. I would say get the hostages back, release, and then if there's a cease. But let's use this moment in that way. That's how I feel. That's the substance of this particular moment in time that prompted me to write that piece. The bigger meta stylistic question is we don't have, we both have family in Israel, but our children are not serving in the Israeli military. We're not paying taxes. We're not living there. Voting there. So who are we as American Jews from the cheap seats to weigh in on, right? If we want to support a Masorti shul, God bless, you should be well, but leave the fighting to us. Thank you very much. And that I struggle with, because my entire rabbinate this last year, and I imagine yours as well, we have become outposts for defending Israel in the public sphere. That has been my job description this last year. And so am I expected to have only one gear in that, which is defense of Israel, or am I allowed to also express potentially dissent with a decision out of a place of love? And I struggle with that actively, and what I'm trying to do is model a way that we can navigate. I'll tell you another piece that when Netanyahu came, this was criticism from the other side, when Netanyahu spoke, I think over the summer in DC, and I wrote a piece saying now American Jews should not protest the Netanyahu visit when he came to DC. And I was criticized. I said, why was it okay for you to protest the judicial reforms when Netanyahu spoke at the UN in 2023, but we can't protest there? Because I have friends in both camps. And I said, well, there's a fundamental difference, because when I was protesting outside the UN, the protest began with Hatikva and took place in a sea of Israeli flags. And if you went to DC and protested Netanyahu's visit then, you'd be doing so with other protesters who seek the destruction of the state of Israel. And so that was a moment, back to your earlier question, Michael, one of the things I would say to the Mayas of the world is use your brain, right? Not every situation is the same. We have to be very intentional about when we speak out and voice criticism, and when we hold back, as in the DC, that was a time not to speak out. But there are times to speak out, and we have to use our brains to know which one is which.
The one thing I would respond, and as you were speaking, Israel has shown remarkable creativity on the military front. But it does feel like it is also suffering from a failure of imagination as to how to find a way out of this quagmire. Is there a better path? Here I'm not talking about a solution. I don't think we should be using that term. There's a solution. Is there a better path that we can go down that would benefit the people of that land? And here, I'm wondering if there isn't a failure of imagination. If we simply just say, we're dealing with Amalek here, we're dealing with our enemies, and there is evidence for some of that. There is a through line between 1929 and what happened, and the massacres that took place in 1929, and the slogans that were used then that were also used by Hamas on October 7th. There is a through line. Is there another, can we make an adjustment here? And that's what I think is so important about what you're saying, Elliot. I think to ask the question, to open the door, to see what's possible. That I'm wondering, is that really happening right now? And when you have the assassination or the killing of the head of Hamas, the thought leader on this issue, is there a moment here, right, when we might begin to find something a little different? I think that's the question on the table.
And just to raise it, because why not? I'm in someone else's shul, and it gets really hard during an election season.
Yep.
Because we live in such a polarized moment where we will zap someone as a colonialist oppressor or a self-hating Jew, and we put them in boxes, and we refuse to countenance the idea that we're all just trying to figure this one out, and we're trying to both affirm Israel's right to self-defense and self-determination and actively seek a day-after plan. Mm-hmm. And that's complicated. Yeah. And there's as many views of how that can happen as there are people in this room. And we don't all agree, but we're all figuring it out. But it's so much easier to, name call
yeah.
than it is, or to say that in supporting this candidate or that candidate, you are throwing your people under a bus.
That's right.
And it's toxic. And I think one of my goals of this book is actually to model how to have a conversation where two Jews, either from political viewpoints or generationally, can have two different visions of what is in the best interest of Israel and American Jewry, and we all sit at the same table together. And I think that's a huge challenge that for the next 3 weeks isn't going to get any easier.
No. And I think it's been very hard for rabbis. I just will say this very directly, and we talked about this a little earlier, that constantly walking on eggshells, because whatever you say from the bima will be read politically. So there's no conversation. So you end up parsing every word. And you've come out at times and you've been critical of candidates, and you've also taken the heat for that as well, because we're not allowed to be critical of one side. If one of the candidates says something that is troubling or stunning in some way, or suddenly you're carrying the water for the other side. There's no conversation. And that is, not only is it dangerous, but it's un-Jewish. It's un-Jewish, and I think we need to be able to say that. That it is un-Jewish to be in a situation where you can't have a thoughtful conversation, as you were alluding to.
Yeah, and we have to be willing to acknowledge the other, right? That's Hillel and Shammai, right? Hillel and Shammai, the great rabbinic pairing of old, would debate every little matter of Jewish ritual, theology, or otherwise. And Hillel, there are far more campus Hillels than there are campus Shammais, but that's not a reflection of Hillel always being right. It was a fact that the manner by which he argued his point would always state the other side prior to stating his own side. And so I think that sort of modality of dialogue is really what our community needs, right? That I actually think, and now you can cut this, I actually think there's a real good debate to have about which political party is or isn't in the best interests of the Jewish people in the state of Israel. I think that's a reasonable conversation for reasonable people to have. But I would encourage you just to have it in a way that you don't call someone a self-hating X should they have a view different than your own. We need to figure out a way to house that conversation.
No question. I mean, and I think it's worth actually starting around our own kitchen tables, looking at it, talking about the other side, as opposed to saying, I can't believe that so-and-so is talking about voting for so-and-so. I just can't believe it. I thought they were sane. Right? And we allow that comment to go by unchallenged. What if you actually sat around a table and took the other position, played it out? And here I'm not asking, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. Simply just to have the conversation, to think about it. That's what is, I think, missing. And it opens us up in all kinds of ways. And as I said a moment ago, it is un-Jewish. We do want to allow for a couple of questions. So I'm going to ask one more question.
Yes, sir.
Then I'm going to go back to your book because I want you to get this book, and I want you to read this book because I think Elliot has done a marvelous job doing exactly what he was doing tonight, which is opening up the questions and doing it in a very, very thoughtful way. So at the end, towards the end of the book, there was one thing I did want to note. I don't want to forget this because I just, you had a chapter on vigilance and empathy. And I love the name of the chapter because we would normally think of it as vigilance or empathy. You said vigilance and empathy. I don't remember which came first, but the word "and" is what I'm focused on. Talk about that for a minute, because you had to make that decision in that chapter, because I think we normally think of one or the other.
Yeah, so it actually runs through many of the questions that you've been asking, that the book of Esther, as noted, the spine of the book, is a book which doesn't actually end just with the happy ending of, Esther coming out as a Jewish woman. It ends in, I think it's chapter 9, which has a vicious, vengeful reaction of the Jewish community exacting wrath upon the would-be destroyers of, it's really gruesome stuff at the end of the book of Esther. And I make the point that whereas there's the festive interpretation of Esther, there's also this dark, vengeful side of the book of Esther. At the Passover Seder, we talk about you should know the heart of the stranger because you were once a stranger in a strange land. Empathy for the other. All who are hungry, come and eat. But there's also the moment that we stand up, and some of us sing Elijah the prophet, but some of us also say, Shvoch et chamatcha al hagoyim asher lo yada'ucha, that God pour out your wrath upon the nations, right? There is this vengeful part of hatred of the other, and the reason it's and not or is because I say these are two foundational Jewish responses to historic vulnerability.
Yes.
Right? The Holocaust survivor who comes out of the Shoah with a universal inclination, or the Holocaust survivor coming out of the Shoah saying everyone's out to kill the Jews, right? We probably all know both, right? They're both part of the Jewish condition. And I think one of the challenges of this moment, and we see both playing out in Israeli politics, right? It's not a surprise that the settler movement and Peace Now both emerged in the wake of the 73 war. These are both responses to trauma. Mm-hmm. We are experiencing trauma right now as a Jewish people. Are we going to choose empathy, or are we going to choose vigilance or vengeance, or what will the combination look like?
And that applies, by the way, to the active rabbinate when we talk about the suffering in Gaza. Because there are lots of Jews who would say, why are you talking about them? Why bother? Why should you? Are they talking about us? And I have great respect for the fact that you have been very clear on that issue again and again. And I know you've taken heat for it, and I've taken heat in my own way here, because every Shabbos, every service, when we pray for healing, I always make a point of talking about those who are suffering in Gaza. Right? There are innocent people suffering in Gaza. Not every person suffering in Gaza is innocent, but there are innocent people suffering in Gaza. And as you have noted, it would mean that we're a little less human if we don't acknowledge that. And I want to thank you for that stand that you've taken. And I think it's something for all of us to think about empathy and vigilance as two pillars, two Jewish pillars. Last question that I interrupted myself before I asked was regarding the broken tablets. It's how you kind of bring things together in your book in a very beautiful way. And I think it's a great way to kind of end my part, and then we'll have a couple questions.
Yeah, so look, I talk about mourning, and we all just went through the conclusion of the 1-year mourning, which is very powerful in the sense of the immediate trauma, the shloshim, the 30 days, going through this year, but it's also limited because the trauma endures. The war is still going on. The hostages are still captive. This doesn't fit into a easy rubric of we lost a person on such and such day. So I use the image in the book of the broken tablets that were shattered at the base of Mount Sinai. And famously, Moses didn't leave those shards at the base of the mountain, but picked them up and continued in his journey towards the promised land. And so it's a powerful image for anyone who's ever suffered loss, that we take our losses with us even as we seek to be whole. and I think it very much speaks to the Jewish people as a whole at this moment, that we're carrying those broken shards with us.
It's part of our story. Rabbi Forrester is going to take a few. He's got a microphone, so we'll try. We'll get to as many as possible. Please make them questions and not statements, and please. Jay, go ahead. You want to start over here? Scooter. If you'd stand up, that would be helpful. Sorry to trouble you with that, but.
First of all, thank you very much. One of the things that I found great about the book is you're speaking about education, and I wish you would speak about that a little bit more, but also maybe Americanizing it a little bit more than just teaching about Israel education to Jewish students, but also, to Rabbi Siegel's point, kind of the arc of Jewish history in the United States and our participation in the movements of the 60s and 70s, and how we can perhaps draw in some of the progressive left, and what you think about that.
So, thank you, Scooter. It's good to see you, and Molly should have a safe, good delivery. There's two totally separate questions in that. Number one is doubling down on Jewish education, which, shocker, I believe in, right? We should, this is a time, and the underbelly of what I said about making Israel support the religion of American Jewry is that we did it as a compensatory act to cover up a paper-thin Jewish identity. It's easier to write it. I love APAC. I interned for APAC in college, everything. But we made it a substitute religion as opposed to focusing on religion. And I think we should double down on literacy, love, all the things that you and I know to make up a solid Jewish education. I think the other question is fascinating, which is how can we encourage, instill education outside of the Jewish community about the connection between the Jewish people and Israel. That's sort of the nub of it, which I think would be, and there are organizations, the AJCs, one of the sub-stories of this past year for me. I don't know if you've been dealing with this a lot, but I have invested a huge amount of my time in working with the principals of the independent secular schools by way of the AJC, that they should have the tools to speak intelligently about the Jewish connection to Israel. And so that doesn't happen by fairy dust. That happens because there are educators working actively in established organizations to build curriculum that can be deployed into secular, non-Jewish environments.
I'm sorry to say that in Chicago, the Chicago public school system is a tougher nut to crack at this point in time. Just to kind of leave it at that. To the point that, I mean, it is at a point in Chicago where millions of dollars are being invested right now to open a new Jewish high school downtown in Chicago, because the Chicago public school system is becoming, and by the way, also some of the private schools, are becoming places where Jewish students who identify as Zionists feel unsafe. So we are in, this is sort of ground zero for this, and our mayor has unfortunately not been very supportive of these ideas, to put it mildly. And that's a whole other story that we can talk about, but listen, we are working very hard on these issues. We have a petition, we are working very hard on it, but it is really an uphill struggle. We have another question over here. Go ahead, Jay.
Rabbi, two-part question. you, and Rabbi Siegel alluded to it during the Maya section of your book. Just curious if you actually went back and had that conversation with Maya and how it went. And tagging on to that is, we talk about casting a wide tent for our community, and if we bring people into this wide tent and pull it too tightly, are there concerns that it may collapse from the middle? And how do you...
Wait, that if we're too wide,
right,
then
people
right.
who are in the middle get lost. Is there a concern around that?
Yeah, so Maya continues to show up at my dinner table at odd hours and is an active part of my extended family life. So, and she's, I will keep her anonymity, but she's unique in God's presence, but interchangeable with any other 23-year-old, you know, and we continue the conversation very actively. And she's tickled by the whole thing, because of all the chapters in the book that people sort of focus on, and it's an excellent book, but that Maya chapter clearly struck a chord with people. And I mean, it's a form of what Rabbi Siegel was asking. Are there certain conversations you don't have, right? Whatever that adage is, if you don't stand for anything, you stand for nothing. And I think there are, you know, our friend Yossi Klein Halevi makes a distinction between people and institutions. I'm not sure if I 100% buy it, but it's a helpful place to begin. I don't believe in writing off people. Institutions I can write off. I think that there are players in the Jewish world that I don't think need to be sitting at the table. But a 20-year-old who's a member of that organization, I think I will dignify that person's humanity.
Go ahead.
Hi.
Steve, but you got to stand up.
I just have a question about Jewish values and how that plays into Jewish education. I kind of see there's a universal values of Tikkun Olam, and then there's more particular values around peoplehood. Do you feel like there's been a tension in kind of Jewish education and maybe moving forward about focusing too much on Tikkun Olam and not enough on the particular issues, and kind of how do you see that future of kind of with the universal values versus the particular values?
So I'll briefly
go
and then Rabbi. Look, I would say that it goes into this empathy or vigilance. I would like to live in the and, not in the or. And whether that is empathy for Palestinian suffering as I assert Israel's right to self-determination, or whether or not it is for an expression of my Jewish life and living to be for a progressive cause, doesn't stand in contradiction to my passionate observance of the Sabbath, right? I think we need to figure out how to have both. That for me, that's a vibrant Jewish identity. We are being told by the extremes that you have to pick one or the other, and want what I call the sane center, the ones who live between the 40-yard lines, to speak loudly and with passion that it's a false choice.
The only thing I would add to that is that I think we could have done a better job in presenting the Jewish aspect of our actions when it comes to social justice. That we tended to use terminology that was more progressive than it was Jewish, or we didn't look at the text carefully enough. And we didn't really impress on young people in a way that I think we could have the whole notion that there's a chiyuv, there's an obligation here to engage, to feed the hungry as a Jew, because this is a Jewish value. And that building a home for someone is a Jewish value. Certainly gathering on Sukkot, that is a powerful idea. I mean, all of those ideas have a Jewish base, and I'm not sure we always did the best job in making that clear. And that's part of the comfort that we were feeling in America, And I think that it's time for us to rethink that. And the "and" that you are underscoring, I think, is vitally important. I think we have time for 2 more questions. Okay.
Okay. One, and then we'll come back up.
Okay.
Hello. My name is Mark Imponen. I'm a JBC student here, Jews by Choice program for conversion. I don't really have a question, but more like a comment. I'm thankful that I came here tonight. I don't really know why I came because I don't like books. I don't like to read. But listening to your conversation, it was such a blessing. And I just want to say that, because there's so many things that you said that I want to address. I want to say that Jews are not alone. I don't know if you're looking for support within the Jewish community or outside, but there's certainly support outside of the Jewish community. I'm one of them. I don't know if I'm going to be technically or politically correct about it, but I used to be a Christian. But now I recognize where the true God is, and that's why I'm here.
Well, I'm really glad. Thank you so much for your comments. And I think you've touched all of our hearts. So thank you so much for your support and being part of this community. We have time for 1 more question. All right, I'll tell you what we'll do. I'm gonna direct Rabbi Forrester, this gentleman here, and then Sam, you have the last question. Go ahead. This gentleman. Oh, go ahead. That gentleman there, and then this gentleman here.
Hello. What do you think of the notion that had there been no October 7th, we'd still be seeing a pretty dramatic rise in anti-Semitism because we're sort of caught in the last gasp of white nationalism in America, or maybe not the last gasp, maybe they'll win, but we're going to see a dramatic change in America over the next 20 years because the white people are not going to go quietly into the minority, and where does that leave us? So as a broader scope of history, that had there been no October 7th,
This is your
where
question.
would we be?
This is your question, Rabbi Cosgrove.
Were we going to take 3 and then do... I think, during COVID, everyone said that COVID was not just a disruptor, but it was an accelerant for trends that were already in place. And I do think that I think that to a certain degree, when the history is written, October 7th was a wake-up call that brought in full relief fault lines that may have well preceded October 7th itself. I think one of the questions I have, which it's too early to answer, is this surge of Jewish identity post-October 7th that came from a place of trauma. How long is that going to last for? And how can that be sustained beyond the trauma itself, right? It was great to be a Jew on October 6th. It's still great to be a Jew today. I don't want my Judaism or the Judaism that I teach, preach, to be defined by the hatred of others. And so I think that'll goes to an earlier question about Jewish education, about how to sustain that well beyond the horrors of October 7th.
Rabbi, can you remind me of the last one?
And Sam, go ahead.
Rabbi, it's great to have you back here. And we joined sort of toward the beginning of your tenure here, and we knew you were going to be a star. My name's Sam Tenenbaum. Just one quick background. I'm the advisor to the Jewish law students at Northwestern. So I've lived everything you guys have been talking about. I haven't had a chance to read the book because I just got it tonight. But I think in some ways, October 7th, look, it's a trauma. It's a cloud that hangs over everyone. But I have to tell you, at least in my experience with my students, and I hope it comes through in your book, there's a lot of hope for the younger generation. My students have stepped up, and students, Rabbi knows, students all over Chicago, Jewish students all over Chicago and all over the country, I'm sure you've seen it in New York, have stepped up. And I think we have a lot to be hopeful about as well. A lot of tonight seemed to be, you know, oh no, we've got our poor Jewish depression again. But there's some good that's coming out of this. I think you alluded to that in the answer to the last question. So I wanted to be sure that people had that sense that all is not lost with the young people. That's actually a very small minority who are the Mayas, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Sam, and thank you for all you do with the Jewish law students. Yes, and things in this world don't just happen, right? Hope is empty unless it's accompanied by action. Things in this world happen because we make them happen. And so there has been what Steve said, there's been a surge of Jewish identity. Are we going to invest in Jewish education? Are we going to double down on whatever the efforts are going to be? I wouldn't have chosen this moment for everything in the world. It's a horrible moment that we're living through. And how are we going to look back on this moment saying, whereas we didn't choose this moment and we would have given everything in our world to have it otherwise, we are who we are by way of the investments we make at this moment.
The only thing I would add is that we have agency. We are not helpless. We remain the most powerful diaspora community in Jewish history, not simply in the world, but in Jewish history. But power needs to be exercised, and it needs to be exercised thoughtfully. And we have a lot of work to do. We have gotten the ultimate wake-up call. And just to build on what Elliot said, the ball's in our court right now, but we can do it. Jews have been faced with challenges in the past and have done remarkable things. We wouldn't be here had they not. That's our responsibility to the next generations, to the future, is to be those people who step up and make the hard choices and move forward in creative and thoughtful ways. I'm going to end this session with our thanks to Rabbi Cosgrove, but also with his words. This is how his book ends. The chapter is "To Begin Again." In the many weddings which I have officiated since October 7th, I have found my thoughts lingering on the well-known Jewish ritual, always powerful, more so now. The shards beneath the wedding canopy represent the Jewish people broken apart and scattered, and yet, like the wedding couple taking their first step into the future by way of those shards, so too must we, holding pain even as we dream of brighter times, ready to begin and begin again. Remembering the hurt, but nevertheless putting one foot ahead of the other. It is not everything, but it is a place to start. And God knows we are all in need of a place to start. Wholeness and brokenness, every step of the way on our journey toward the promised land. Thank you, Elliot Cosgrove.